Rich kid forced to work minimum wage job. What he learns transforms his family's legacy. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. When a reckless tech heir's world comes crashing down, he finds himself mopping floors at a homeless shelter. Little does he know, this humbling experience will uncover a web of deceit that threatens not just his family's empire, but the lives of society's most vulnerable. As he navigates a world he never knew existed, he'll face a choice that could cost him everything or change the course of countless lives forever. The screeching of tires against asphalt pierced the night air, followed by the sickening crunch of metal on metal. 23-year-old Ethan Blackwood's world spun violently as his Ferrari careened off the road, finally coming to rest against a sturdy oak tree. The acrid smell of burnt rubber and the hiss of steam from the mangled hood filled his senses as he struggled to focus his bleary vision. Ethan's head throbbed, a mixture of the impact and the copious amounts of alcohol he'd consumed at the exclusive rooftop party he'd just left. As he fumbled with his seatbelt, the realization of what had just happened began to seep through his alcohol-addled brain. He'd done it again. Another reckless night that ended in disaster. Flashing lights and sirens grew louder as emergency vehicles approached. Ethan stumbled out of the wreckage, his designer suit torn and stained. He squinted at the crumpled form of another car a few yards away, a wave of nausea washing over him that had nothing to do with his intoxication. "Oh God," he muttered, his heart racing. "Please, no." Officer Sarah Martinez was first on the scene, her practiced eyes taking in the carnage before her. She approached Ethan, who was swaying unsteadily on his feet. "Sir, are you all right? We need to check you for injuries," she said firmly, reaching out to steady him. Ethan tried to focus on her face, but the world kept tilting. "I'm fine," he slurred. Just a little shaken up. How's the other driver?" Officer Martinez's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to need you to submit to a breathalyzer test." As paramedics rushed to attend to the other vehicle's occupants, Ethan's stomach churned with dread. He knew he was well over the legal limit. This wasn't his first brush with the law, but it was by far the most serious. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, stern-faced officers, and the growing realization that this time, his family's money and influence might not be enough to sweep things under the rug. As dawn broke over the city skyline, Ethan found himself sitting in a stark interrogation room, facing the grim reality of his actions. District Attorney Helena Reyes entered the room, her no-nonsense demeanor a stark contrast to Ethan's disheveled appearance. She sat across from him, laying out a file on the table between them. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice cool and professional. "I hope you understand the gravity of your situation. This isn't your first offense, and the injuries sustained by the other driver are severe." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "My lawyers dash. Your lawyers can't make this go away." De Reyes cut him off. "But I'm here to offer you a choice." Ethan leaned forward, a flicker of hope in his bloodshot eyes. "You have two options," she continued. "You can face the full extent of the law, which, given your history and the circumstances of this accident, will likely result in significant jail time." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Or you can agree to a rehabilitation program of my design." "Rehab?" Ethan scoffed. "Been there, done that. Didn't take, obviously." De Reyes's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a luxury rehab center, Mr. Blackwood. I'm talking about 6 months of community service at the Harmony House homeless shelter, working minimum wage, living on-site with mandatory counseling and sobriety checks. You'll be required to surrender your trust fund access for the duration." Ethan's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. Me? Work at a homeless shelter? It's that or jail, Mr. Blackwood. Your choice." As the reality of his situation sank in, Ethan felt the walls of his privileged world closing in around him. The thought of trading his penthouse for a bunk in a shelter made him want to retch. But the alternative, a prison cell, was even more unthinkable. With a shaky hand, he reached for the pen De Reyes had placed on the table. As he signed the agreement, He had no idea that this moment would be the first step on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and the world he lived in. The harsh fluorescent lights of Harmony House homeless shelter buzzed overhead as Ethan Blackwood stood awkwardly in the doorway, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Gone were his tailored suits and Italian leather shoes, replaced by off-the-rack jeans and a plain t-shirt that felt foreign against his skin. Maria Rodriguez, the shelter's no-nonsense director, eyed him skeptically. "So, you're our new volunteer," she said, her tone making it clear she knew this was no act of charity on his part. "I hope you're ready to work, Mr. Blackwood. We don't coddle anyone here, regardless of their background." Ethan forced a smile, trying to mask his discomfort. "Of course, Ms. Rodriguez. I'm here to learn and help in any way I can." Maria raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "We'll see about that. Follow me." As they walked through the shelter, Ethan's senses were assaulted by unfamiliar sights and smells. The dingy walls, the lingering odor of industrial cleaner mixed with body odor, and the sounds of coughing and muffled conversations created an atmosphere worlds away from the luxury he was accustomed to. They passed the dining area, where a diverse group of people sat at long tables, some engaged in quiet conversation, others staring vacantly into space. Ethan felt their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and wariness. "This will be your bunk," Maria said, gesturing to a narrow bed in a room filled with similar cots. "You'll share this space with 7 others. Lights out at 10 p.m., wake-up call at 6 a.m. Ethan's heart sank as he took in the cramped quarters. "And where do I, keep my things?" Maria pointed to a small locker at the foot of the bed. "That's yours. I suggest you don't bring anything valuable. Now, let's go over your duties." The next hour was a whirlwind of information as Maria outlined his responsibilities: serving meals, cleaning bathrooms, mopping floors, and assisting with intake procedures for new arrivals. Each task sounded more daunting than the last to Ethan, who had never so much as made his own bed. As evening approached, Ethan found himself in the kitchen, awkwardly wielding a serving spoon as a line of shelter residents filed past. He tried to smile, but the sheer diversity of the people before him, old, young, families with children, veterans with haunted eyes, left him feeling overwhelmed and out of his depth. "Hey, new guy," a gruff voice called out. Ethan looked up to see a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard eyeing him impatiently. "You gonna serve that soup? Or are you waiting for it to get cold?" "Oh, right. Sorry." Ethan stammered, clumsily ladling soup into the man's bowl. Some of it sloshed over the side, earning him a disapproving look. "First day, huh?" the man asked, his tone softening slightly. "I'm Frank. Been coming here on and off for a couple years now." Ethan nodded, grateful for the friendly overture. "Yeah, first day. I'm Ethan." Frank studied him for a moment. "You don't look like the usual volunteers we get around here. What's your story, kid?" Before Ethan could respond, Maria's voice cut through the din of the dining room. "Ethan, we need more trays on the line. Now!" As Ethan rushed to comply, nearly tripping over his own feet, he could hear Frank chuckling behind him. "Welcome to Harmony House, Ethan. Hope you're a quick learner." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dirty dishes, mop buckets, and aching muscles Ethan didn't even know he had. By the time he collapsed onto his bunk that night, every fiber of his being longed for the comfort of his king-sized memory foam mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets. As he lay there, listening to the snores and murmurs of his bunkmates, the reality of his situation truly began to sink in. This wasn't some bad dream he could wake up from, or a problem his father's money could solve. For the next 6 months, this was his life. Ethan rolled over, wincing at the creaking of the metal bed frame. As he closed his eyes, trying to block out the unfamiliar sounds and smells around him, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a terrifying thought. What if 6 months of this wasn't enough? What if, after all this, he still ended up in prison? With that unsettling thought, Ethan drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that his journey was only beginning, and that the lessons awaiting him would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the grimy windows of Harmony House, Ethan was jolted awake by the harsh blare of an industrial alarm. For a moment, he lay disoriented, his brain struggling to reconcile the unfamiliar surroundings with his memories. Then reality came crashing back. This was his new life, at least for the next 6 months. Groaning, Ethan dragged himself out of bed, his muscles protesting from the previous day's unaccustomed labor. He made his way to the communal bathrooms, cringing at the cold tile under his bare feet and the less than pristine conditions of the facilities. As he splashed water on his face, Ethan caught his reflection in the scratched mirror above the sink. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and a day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw. He hardly recognized himself. "Better get a move on, pretty boy," a voice called out behind him. Ethan turned to see Frank, the man he'd met in the serving line yesterday. Maria doesn't take kindly to latecomers, no matter how rough their first night was. Ethan nodded gratefully and hurried to get dressed. By the time he made it to the kitchen, most of the other volunteers were already busy preparing breakfast. Maria fixed him with a stern look but said nothing as she handed him an apron and pointed him towards a mountain of potatoes waiting to be peeled. As Ethan awkwardly fumbled with the peeler, his mind wandered to thoughts of his family. By now, news of his rehabilitation would have spread through their social circle. He could almost hear the whispers, see the pitying looks and barely concealed smirks. The thought made his cheeks burn with shame. "You're holding it wrong," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Ethan looked up to see a young woman with warm brown eyes and a kind smile. "Here, let me show you." She demonstrated the proper technique, her hands moving with practiced ease. "I'm Zoe, by the way," she said as she worked. "You must be the new volunteer Maria mentioned." Ethan nodded, trying to mimic her movements. "Ethan, and yeah, I guess word travels fast around here." Zoe shrugged. "It's a small community. We don't get many new faces, especially ones that look like they just stepped out of a fashion magazine." Ethan felt his face grow hot again, this time for a different reason. "Is it that obvious I don't belong here?" Zoe's expression softened. "Everyone belongs here, Ethan. That's kind of the point. But if you're asking if you stick out, yeah, a little. Don't worry, though. You'll find your footing." As they worked side by side, Zoe filled Ethan in on the daily routines of the shelter and the stories of some of the regular residents. Ethan found himself hanging on her every word, fascinated by this world he'd never given a second thought to before. The morning passed quickly, and soon the shelter was bustling with activity as residents came in for breakfast. Ethan took his place in the serving line, feeling slightly more confident than the day before. As he ladled out portions of scrambled eggs and hash browns, Ethan began to notice things he'd overlooked in his initial shock yesterday. The way some residents avoided eye contact, while others seemed eager for even the briefest interaction. The mother who made sure her children were served before taking anything for herself. The elderly man whose hands shook as he held out his tray. Each face told a story, and Ethan found himself wondering about the circumstances that had brought these people here. How many of them had once led lives not so different from his own? How easily could he have ended up in their place, if not for the accident of his birth into wealth and privilege? As the breakfast rush wound down, Maria approached Ethan. "Not bad for your second day," she said, her tone grudgingly approving. "But now comes the real test. We're short-staffed at the intake desk. Think you can handle it?" Ethan hesitated. The thought of being responsible for processing new arrivals, of being the first point of contact for people at their most vulnerable, was daunting. But he also felt a strange urge to prove himself, to show Maria and himself that he was capable of more than she might think. "I'll do my best," he said, squaring his shoulders. Maria nodded, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in her eyes. "That's all we ask of anyone here. Zoe will show you the ropes." As Ethan followed Zoe to the intake area, he felt a mix of trepidation and an unfamiliar sense of purpose. For the first time in his life, he was being asked to do something truly meaningful, to be responsible for more than just his own pleasure and comfort. Little did he know that this new role would soon bring him face to face with a truth that would shake the very foundations of his world. The intake desk at Harmony House was a simple folding table set up near the entrance, a stark contrast to the sleek reception areas Ethan was accustomed to. Zoe walked him through the intake process, collecting basic information, assessing immediate needs, and explaining shelter rules and available resources. "Remember," Zoe said, her voice gentle but firm, "for many people, coming here is a last resort. They might be scared, angry, or ashamed. Your job is to make them feel welcome and safe." Ethan nodded, trying to quell the nervous flutter in his stomach. As if on cue, the shelter's doors opened, and a man in his mid-50s entered. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried himself with a dignity that seemed at odds with his circumstances. "Hi there," Ethan said, attempting a warm smile. "Welcome to Harmony House. Can I help you get settled in?" The man approached the desk slowly, his eyes darting around the room. I've never done this before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where else to go." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "That's okay, sir. You're in the right place. Can you tell me your name?" "Robert," the man replied. "Robert Caldwell." As Ethan began the intake process, Robert's story unfolded. He'd been a middle manager at a local manufacturing plant for over 20 years, with a house in the suburbs and 2 kids in college. Then came the layoffs, the months of fruitless job searching, the mounting bills, and finally, the foreclosure. "I stayed with friends as long as I could," Robert explained, his eyes fixed on the table. "But I couldn't keep imposing. My kids, they don't know. I couldn't bear to tell them." Ethan's mind reeled. Robert's story hit uncomfortably close to home, reminding him of the countless employees his father had laid off over the years in the name of streamlining operations. How many Roberts had been created by his family's pursuit of ever-increasing profits? As he finished the paperwork, Ethan felt an overwhelming urge to do more. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, leaning in slightly, "we have job placement services here, and I might have some contacts in the tech industry. If you're interested, I could see about setting up some interviews." Robert looked up, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. "You'd do that? For a stranger?" Ethan nodded, surprising himself with his own sincerity. "Of course, that's why we're here, right?" As Robert was led away to get settled, Zoe touched Ethan's arm gently. "That was really good," she said. "But be careful about making promises you can't keep. Hope is a powerful thing, and these folks have had enough disappointments." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He'd spoken without thinking, caught up in the moment. But now that he'd made the offer, he was determined to follow through. He made a mental note to reach out to some old college acquaintances who'd gone into recruiting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of intakes, each story leaving its mark on Ethan. A young mother fleeing an abusive relationship. An elderly couple evicted from their apartment when the building was sold to developers. A teenager who'd aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go. By the time his shift ended, Ethan was emotionally and physically exhausted. But as he made his way to the dining hall for dinner, he realized something had changed. For the first time in his life, he felt like he'd done something genuinely worthwhile. As he sat down with his tray, Frank plopped down across from him. "So, intake desk, huh?" the older man said, a knowing look in his eyes. "Bet that was an eye-opener." Ethan nodded, pushing his food around his plate. "I had no idea. I knew homelessness was a problem, but I never really thought about the individuals, you know?" Frank chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, it's easy to ignore when it's just statistics. Not so easy when it's got a face and a name, is it?" As they ate, Frank shared some of his own story, a veteran who'd struggled with PTSD and addiction before finding his way to Harmony House. Ethan listened, rapt, realizing how little he truly knew about the world beyond his privileged bubble. Later that night, as Ethan lay in his bunk, his mind raced. He thought about Robert, about Frank, about all the stories he'd heard that day. And he thought about his family's company, about the decisions made in boardrooms that had ripple effects reaching far beyond spreadsheets and stock prices. For the first time, Ethan began to question the world he'd grown up in, the values he'd taken for granted. As sleep finally claimed him, one thought echoed in his mind. There had to be a better way, and maybe, just maybe, he could be part of finding it. Little did Ethan know that his newfound resolve would soon be put to the test, as the shadows of his family's past began to loom over Harmony House, threatening not just his own journey of redemption, but the very existence of the shelter and the fragile lives it protected. Weeks passed, and Ethan found himself settling into a routine at Harmony House. The work was still challenging, but he no longer dreaded the early mornings or the long hours on his feet. Instead, he found a sense of purpose in each task, no matter how menial it might have seemed to his old self. One morning, as Ethan was mopping the hallway outside the administrative offices, he overheard a heated conversation between Maria and someone he didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of him, and he slowed his work to listen. "Can't just force us out." Maria's voice was strained, anger barely contained. "Where are these people supposed to go?" A man's voice responded, smooth and practiced. "I understand your concern, Ms. Rodriguez, but the decision has been made. This property has been slated for redevelopment. You have 60 days to vacate." Ethan's blood ran cold. Vacate? They were closing Harmony House? He leaned closer to the partially open door, straining to hear more. "This is outrageous," Maria shot back. "We've been here for 20 years. We provide an essential service to this community. You can't just dash." "I'm afraid we can." The man cut her off. "The paperwork is all in order. I suggest you start looking for alternative locations." Ethan heard footsteps approaching and quickly resumed his mopping, his mind racing. As the door opened, he glanced up, and his heart nearly stopped. Walking out of Maria's office was none other than Richard Blackwood, Ethan's father. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Richard's expression flickered with surprise, then hardened into a mask of indifference. Without a word, he strode past Ethan and out of the shelter. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, the mop forgotten in his hands. What was his father doing here? And why was Harmony House being forced to close? Before he could process what he'd just witnessed, Maria emerged from her office, her face drawn and tired. She paused when she saw Ethan. "How much did you hear?" she asked, her voice weary. Ethan swallowed hard. "Enough," he admitted. "Maria, what's going on? Why was my father here?" Maria's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed. "Your father? That was Richard Blackwood." She let out a bitter laugh. "Well, isn't that just perfect? Come on, we need to talk." In her office, Maria explained the situation. Blackwood Tech, Ethan's family company, had recently acquired a real estate development firm. Their first major project? Luxury condos and high-end retail space right where Harmony House currently stood. "But they can't just kick everyone out," Ethan protested. "What about all the people who depend on this place?" Maria shook her head. "They can, and they are. It's all perfectly legal. We don't own this building, Ethan. We lease it, and our lease is up for renewal. They're within their rights to not renew it." Ethan felt sick. This was his family's doing. His family was responsible for potentially putting hundreds of vulnerable people back on the streets. "There has to be something we can do," he said, his mind racing. "Maybe I could talk to my father, explain the situation dash." "No," Maria cut him off firmly. "You're here as part of your rehabilitation, Ethan. I won't have you jeopardizing that. Besides," she added, her tone softening slightly, "I doubt your father would listen. Men like him, they see the world differently." Ethan wanted to argue, to insist that his father wasn't like that. But the words died in his throat, because deep down he knew Maria was right. The Richard Blackwood he'd seen today, coldly dismissing the fates of hundreds of people, was exactly the man his father had always been. Ethan had just been too blind or too self-absorbed to see it before. As he left Maria's office, Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at his father, shame at his family's actions, and a growing sense of desperation. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. But what could he, Ethan Blackwood, disgraced heir and court-mandated volunteer, possibly do to stop it? The news of Harmony House's impending closure spread through the shelter like wildfire. Ethan watched as fear and uncertainty took hold among the residents and staff alike. People he'd come to know and care about over the past weeks now faced an uncertain future, and the weight of his family's role in their distress sat heavy on his shoulders. Unable to sleep, Ethan found himself wandering the shelter late one night. He ended up in the common room, where he was surprised to find Zoe, poring over a stack of papers. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her. Zoe looked up, offering a tired smile. "Too much on my mind. I've been going over our finances, trying to figure out if there's any way we can afford to relocate." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not looking good, Ethan. Even if we could find a suitable building, we don't have the funds for a down payment, let alone higher rent." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "Zoe, there's something I need to tell you about why this is happening." He explained about overhearing the conversation, about recognizing his father. As he spoke, he watched Zoe's expression change from surprise to anger to resignation. "I should have known," she said quietly when he finished. "It's always the same story. People like us were just collateral damage in their quest for more profit." Her words stung, but Ethan couldn't argue. It was the truth, after all. But hearing it from Zoe, seeing the pain and frustration in her eyes, something shifted inside him. "It doesn't have to be this way," he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "My family, they're not bad people, not really. They just don't understand. They've never had to face the consequences of their decisions." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "And you think you can make them understand?" Ethan hesitated. Could he? He thought about his father's cold dismissal, about the years of boardroom decisions that had prioritized profit over people. But he also thought about the lessons he'd learned at Harmony House, about the stories he'd heard and the lives he'd seen changed. "I have to try," he said finally. "I can't just stand by and watch this happen. Not now that I know the truth." Zoe studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, what's your plan?" Over the next few hours, as the shelter slept around them, Ethan and Zoe hatched a plan. It was risky, potentially illegal, and could very well backfire spectacularly. But it was also their best shot at saving Harmony House. The next morning, Ethan approached Maria with their idea. To his surprise, she listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. "You understand what you're proposing, don't you?" she asked when he finished. "If this goes wrong, you could be facing real jail time, not just community service." Ethan nodded, his resolve firm. "I know, but it's worth the risk. These people, this place, it's worth fighting for." Maria's stern expression softened slightly. "You've come a long way, Ethan Blackwood. All right, I'm in. But we do this my way, understand? No cowboy heroics." As they began to put their plan into motion, gathering allies and resources, Ethan felt a mix of excitement and terror. He was about to go up against his own family, against the empire he'd been groomed his entire life to inherit. But as he looked around at the faces of the people he'd come to know and care for at Harmony House, he knew he was doing the right thing. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood was fighting for something bigger than himself. Little did he know, the battle ahead would test not only his newfound convictions, but also the very foundations of his family's legacy. As he prepared to take on Blackwood Tech, Ethan was about to uncover secrets that would shake his world to its core. The plan was set in motion. Ethan, with the help of Zoe and a network of volunteers, began a two-pronged approach to save Harmony House. On one front, they launched a massive public awareness campaign, leveraging social media and local news outlets to shine a light on the shelter's plight and the human cost of Blackwood Tech's development plans. Ethan found himself in front of cameras, telling the stories of the people he'd met at Harmony House. He spoke of Robert, the former middle manager who was now rebuilding his life, and of countless others whose lives had been touched by the shelter. Each interview chipped away at his old persona, replacing the image of the reckless rich kid with that of a passionate advocate for the homeless. On the other front, Ethan delved deep into Blackwood Tech's records, looking for any leverage they could use to force a reconsideration of the development plans. His years of half-listening at dinner parties and board meetings finally paid off as he pieced together a complex web of shell companies and questionable land deals. As their campaign gained traction, Ethan received a call he'd been both expecting and dreading. His father wanted to meet. The meeting was set for a high-end restaurant, a world away from Harmony House. As Ethan entered, he felt the eyes of the other patrons on him, taking in his now unfashionable clothes and the calluses on his hands. Richard Blackwood sat at a corner table, his face an impassive mask. "Sit down, Ethan," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Ethan complied, meeting his father's gaze steadily. "Dad, we need to talk about Harmony House." Richard held up a hand, cutting him off. "No, Ethan, you need to listen. This little crusade of yours ends now. You have no idea what you're meddling with." "I know exactly what I'm meddling with," Ethan shot back. "I'm trying to stop you from destroying people's lives for a quick profit." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You think it's that simple? That we're the villains in some fairy tale? Grow up, Ethan. The world doesn't work that way." "Maybe it should," Ethan replied, his voice quiet but firm. "Dad, I've seen what Harmony House does, the lives it changes. There has to be a way to move forward with development without displacing all those people." For a moment, something flickered in Richard's eyes, pride, regret, but it was quickly replaced by steely resolve. "Enough. I'm willing to overlook this rebellion of yours. Come back to the company, take your rightful place, and we'll forget this ever happened." Ethan felt a pang of longing for his old life, for the easy comfort and familial approval. But then he thought of Zoe's determined face, of Maria's unwavering commitment, of all the residents who had placed their trust in him. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, standing up, "but I can't do that. Not anymore." As he turned to leave, Richard called after him. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. Don't force my hand." Ethan paused at the door, looking back at his father. "No, Dad. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something right." As he stepped out into the street, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Zoe. They had found something big. With a mix of anticipation and dread, Ethan hailed a cab back to Harmony House, knowing that the final confrontation was about to begin. The revelation rocked Harmony House to its core. Buried deep in Blackwood Tech's records, Zoe and Ethan had uncovered evidence of a decades-old scandal. The very land on which Harmony House stood had once been the site of a low-income housing project. Blackwood Tech, under Richard's leadership, had orchestrated its demolition through a series of questionable legal maneuvers and backroom deals. Armed with this information, Ethan knew they had leverage. But he also knew that exposing this could potentially destroy his family's company. And with it, thousands of jobs. As news of their discovery spread, tension mounted. Reporters camped outside Harmony House. Residents anxiously awaited news of their fate, and Blackwood Tech's stock price began to fluctuate wildly. In the midst of the chaos, Ethan received another summons from his father. This time, the meeting was set at Blackwood Tech's headquarters. As Ethan entered the imposing glass and steel building, memories of his childhood washed over him. How many times had he run through these halls, dreaming of the day he'd take over? Now he felt like a stranger in his own home. Richard was waiting in the boardroom, along with the company's top executives and legal team. The atmosphere was tense, charged with unspoken accusations and fear. "I hope you realize what you've done," Richard began, his voice cold. "You're on the verge of destroying everything our family has built." Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "No, Dad, I'm trying to save it, to make it better." For the next hour, Ethan laid out his proposal. A compromise that would allow development to proceed while preserving Harmony House and expanding its services. It would mean less profit, a reimagining of the company's priorities. But it would also mean a chance to right past wrongs and create a legacy they could truly be proud of. As he spoke, Ethan saw the expressions around the table change. Skepticism gave way to interest, then to cautious hope. Even his father's stony facade began to crack. When Ethan finished, silence filled the room. Then slowly Richard stood up. "You've put us in an impossible position, Ethan," he said, his voice heavy. "But perhaps that's exactly what we needed." What followed were days of intense negotiations, legal wrangling, and public relations maneuvering. But in the end, a deal was struck. Harmony House would not only be saved but expanded. Blackwood Tech would partner with local nonprofits to create a mixed-use development that included affordable housing and job training programs. As Ethan stood before the residents and staff of Harmony House to deliver the news, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Zoe stood beside him. Her hand slipped into his, a gesture of support and something more. "This isn't just a victory for Harmony House," Ethan said, his voice ringing out across the crowded room. "It's a victory for all of us, for the idea that business can be a force for good, that profit and compassion aren't mutually exclusive." He saw tears in Maria's eyes, hope on the faces of the residents, and felt the weight of their trust on his shoulders. It was a weight he was now ready to bear. As the room erupted in cheers, Ethan caught sight of his father standing at the back. Richard gave a small nod, a gesture of respect and perhaps a hint of pride. In that moment, Ethan knew that his journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, setbacks and doubts. But he had found his purpose, his true legacy, and he was ready to face whatever came next. As the celebration continued around him, Ethan reflected on how far he'd come. From a reckless rich kid to a champion for the vulnerable, he had transformed not just his own life, but the very legacy of his family name. And it all began with a forced stint at a minimum wage job that opened his eyes to a world he never knew existed. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.